Martha was a woman in her 70s with silver hair neatly tied back and a smile that had never lost its warmth. She had lived a long life, raising children, working hard, and saving carefully for the things that truly mattered to her. One sunny afternoon, she decided to visit a luxury car dealership in town, something she had been thinking about for years. Her old sedan was beginning to fail, and she wanted to treat herself to something grand, something that reflected the life she had built with patience and persistence. When she walked into the dealership, the air was cool and smelled faintly of polished leather and new engines. A young salesman spotted her almost instantly, but instead of greeting her with respect, his lips curled into a smirk. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked in a tone that dripped with sarcasm. "You know these cars are not exactly cheap." Martha smiled politely, ignoring the edge in his voice. "I know that I would like to ask about your latest models, if you have time." The salesman chuckled, glancing at his colleague across the showroom floor, who was already shaking his head with amusement. Of course, he said, waving a hand at a sleek silver vehicle parked in the center. "This beauty right here starts at more than $100,000. Martha stepped closer, admiring the design, her fingers gently brushing along the smooth surface. She asked him about the engine, the comfort, the safety features. Each time she asked, the salesman laughed a little more openly, as though her questions were foolish, as though she could never afford even the tires. At one point, he muttered loud enough for her to hear, "Maybe you should try the used lot down the street, ma'am. This place might be a little out of reach." The words stung, but Martha only nodded with grace. She had dealt with condescension before. She thanked him quietly and walked out without another word. The salesman laughed openly behind her, their voices echoing through the glass doors as she stepped into the sunlight. That night, Martha sat at her kitchen table sipping tea and looking at the check she had prepared days ago. She had saved for this very moment, and no dismissive laugh would take it away from her. The next morning, she drove to another dealership on the other side of town, where she was greeted with kindness and respect. Within hours, she was sitting behind the wheel of a brand new Bentley, its polished black paint gleaming like a mirror under the sun. As she guided the car smoothly out of the lot, her heart swelled, not with pride, but with quiet satisfaction. Later that afternoon, Martha returned to the first dealership, not because she wanted to show off, but because she wanted them to see what they had missed. The roar of the Bentley engine echoed as she pulled into the same parking spot where she had stood ignored the day before. Inside the showroom, the young salesman looked up mid-laugh and froze, his jaw dropping as the old woman he had mocked stepped out of a car worth far more than the one he had flaunted at her. Martha adjusted her scarf, gently smoothed her skirt, and walked inside with the same grace as before. The room fell silent as eyes followed her every step. She approached the salesman slowly, her voice calm and steady. "I came yesterday with questions. You chose not to answer them with respect, so today I found someone who would." "Do you want me to continue with how the salesman reacts and how Martha delivers her final lesson to him and everyone watching?" The salesman swallowed hard, his face flushed red as Martha stood before him. His colleague shifted nervously nearby, pretending to look busy, but sneaking glances at the scene unfolding. Martha kept her gaze steady, her voice calm, yet firm. "Yesterday you laughed at me. You decided that because of my age and appearance, I was not worth your time, but you were wrong." The young man stammered, "I did not mean to offend you, ma'am. I was only joking." Martha tilted her head slightly, her eyes sharp. "A joke loses its humor when it wounds someone. I asked simple questions about your cars, and instead of treating me like a customer, you treated me like a burden." Her words carried through the showroom, and even the receptionist had stopped typing to listen. Martha continued, "I went to another dealership this morning. They welcomed me with respect. They listened and answered with care, and because of that, they earned not only my business but also my trust." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle, then she added, "And that is why I am now the proud owner of the Bentley you just saw outside." The silence that followed was heavy. The salesman tried to muster a smile. "Well, congratulations, ma'am. I am glad you found what you were looking for." Martha gave a faint nod, but her expression remained serious. "I did not just find a car. I found proof that dignity still exists in some places. I only came back to remind you of what you lost." The manager stepped out of his office, having heard every word. He approached quickly with a look of concern on his face. "Mrs. Martha, please accept my apologies for the way you were treated. This is not the way we wish to do business." Martha turned to him, her tone softer, but still resolute. "I do not need your apology, sir. I only hope you'll teach your staff that respect should never depend on appearances, because the next person they laugh at may not be as forgiving as I am." The manager nodded gravely. "I understand, and I promise this will be addressed." Martha gave one last calm look at the salesman, whose arrogance had completely vanished, then turned and walked out of the showroom. Through the glass doors, she could see the Bentley waiting for her, its surface gleaming in the sunlight like a quiet reminder of her strength. Do you want me to continue with how Martha drives away and how people in the town begin to spread her story as an example of dignity and respect? Martha stepped outside into the crisp air, her shoes tapping lightly against the pavement as she approached the Bentley. A small crowd had gathered, curious about the elegant car and the older woman who carried herself with such quiet power. Some whispered in surprise, recognizing her from the day before when she had walked into the same dealership with a plain sweater and worn shoes. A young boy tugged at his father's sleeve, whispering, "Dad, that is the lady they laughed at yesterday." The father gave a slow nod, his eyes following Martha. With respect, he leaned down to his son and said, "Let this be a lesson, son. Never judge people by how they look." Martha opened the car door and eased into the plush leather seat. The engine purred to life, smooth and commanding, as though the car itself shared her dignity. She placed her hands on the wheel and looked out at the crowd, some smiling, some shamefaced. She gave them a calm nod before pulling away from the lot. As she drove through town, heads turned, people stopped mid-conversation to admire the Bentley gliding past. Martha felt no need to wave or boast. The car spoke for itself, but more importantly, so did her presence. At a red light, an elderly man crossing the street caught sight of her. He raised his hand in a respectful salute, and Martha returned it with a gentle smile. She knew word would spread quickly. Small towns carried stories like wildfire, and soon everyone would know how the poor-looking old lady who had been dismissed returned in triumph. Yet Martha did not seek revenge or pride. She only wanted the world to remember that respect was not a gift to be earned, it was a right everyone deserved. The road ahead stretched wide and gleaming, and she drove on with quiet strength, her story already beginning to weave itself into the whispers of the town. Martha continued down the main street, her eyes calm but sharp as she noticed the same dealership salesman standing outside the cafe across the road. He froze when he saw her, his mouth parting slightly, as if he wanted to speak, but no words came. Martha did not slow. She simply let the Bentley roll by with quiet grace. The reflection of the car glimmered in the cafe windows, drawing stares from the people inside. When she turned the corner, Martha steered toward the park where she often sat to think. She parked the Bentley under the shade of an oak tree and stepped out. Children playing nearby stopped and stared, their laughter softening into awe as the shining car caught the sunlight. One little girl ran up to Martha, her eyes wide. She asked softly, "Miss, is that your car?" Martha smiled warmly and crouched down to meet the child's gaze. "Yes, dear, it is." The girl blinked in amazement and whispered, "You look like my grandma, but my grandma says fancy cars are only for rich people." Martha patted the girl's hand and said, "Sometimes people forget that wealth does not always show on the outside. What matters most is kindness and dignity." The child's mother hurried over, apologizing, but Martha waved it off with a gentle laugh. She loved these small moments where truth could be taught without anger or pride. As the day moved on, more townsfolk passed by, each one stopping to admire the Bentley, and each one looking at Martha with newfound respect. Some nodded politely, others offered shy greetings that they never would have given her before. Martha accepted them all gracefully, never boasting, never bitter. She knew life had a way of teaching lessons without her having to speak a single harsh word. She settled back onto the park bench, her hands folded in her lap, as the breeze rustled the leaves above. The Bentley gleamed beside her like a quiet companion, reminding everyone who saw it that appearances could never tell the whole story. The sun dipped lower, casting a golden hue across the park as Martha sat in peaceful silence. People kept approaching, some cautiously, some with curiosity, but all with respect that had been absent only days before. A group of teenagers who once laughed at her worn coat now circled the Bentley, whispering in disbelief. One finally gathered the courage to ask Martha if she would ever let someone ride in it. Martha chuckled softly and replied, "Maybe one day, when you learn that respect comes before privilege." The boys nodded their heads quietly, understanding more than her words alone. Across the street, the dealership salesman had wandered over, his face pale, and uneasy. He shifted from foot to foot before finally stepping toward her. Martha looked up, meeting his eyes with calm authority. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, fumbling for the right words. At last he muttered, "I am sorry, ma'am. I was wrong to treat you the way I did." Martha tilted her head, studying him. Her voice remained steady, but firm. "When you judged me by my coat, and not my character, you showed the world who you really are. Remember that wealth cannot buy humility or decency." The salesman flushed and lowered his gaze, the weight of her words sinking in. As he retreated, Martha leaned back against the bench, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly. She had not bought the Bentley for show nor to prove anyone wrong. She had chosen it as a symbol, a quiet reminder to herself of resilience earned over a lifetime. Nearby, the little girl from earlier waved again, smiling brightly. Martha waved back, her heart softening. This was the kind of recognition she valued, not envy, not whispers, but the innocence of those who saw her for who she truly was. The wind carried the faint scent of blooming flowers. As evening settled, Martha sat steady beside her Bentley, glowing in the fading light, a living lesson to anyone who dared to look beyond appearances. Martha rose from the bench, her cane tapping gently against the cobblestones as she walked toward the Bentley. The crowd parted quietly, some still whispering, some simply staring. The polished car reflected the fading sunlight, and Martha caught her own reflection in the window for a moment, seeing not just the woman she was, but the path she had walked to stand here today. She opened the door with a steady hand and paused, as if savoring the moment before settling into the leather seat. The hum of the engine purred to life with a smoothness that contrasted her age but matched her spirit. The little girl from earlier tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed at Martha. With wide eyes, her mother leaned down, whispered something, then gave a small wave of respect. Martha returned it with a nod and a soft smile. The salesman still lingered by the sidewalk, torn between shame and disbelief. His co-workers, who once shared in the laughter, now avoided his gaze, none of them daring to approach Martha again. Martha placed her hands firmly on the wheel, her mind drifting back to the long years of sacrifice, the endless hours she and her late husband had worked, the dreams they had shared. She could almost hear his voice encouraging her, reminding her of her worth. The Bentley rolled forward slowly, drawing quiet gasps from the crowd as it glided out of the lot. The sound of admiration replaced the earlier snickers echoing in the evening air. Martha drove past the same streets where she had once walked unnoticed, had bowed against judgment, now had turned in awe, but Martha remained calm, her focus steady. For her, it was never about proving the world wrong. It was about living with dignity and remembering that no laugh or insult could define her worth. The city lights flickered on one by one as Martha guided the Bentley through the streets, her presence commanding more than any words could. The Bentley moved smoothly through the evening traffic, its headlights cutting a path through the dim glow of the city. Martha felt the wheel beneath her hand, steady and strong, a symbol of all she had endured and all she had overcome. The stares from strangers at the stoplights no longer startled her. Instead, they seemed to confirm a truth she had always known, that worth was not written on worn shoes or old coats, but carried within. As she passed by shop windows, she caught glimpses of people pointing, some with admiration, some with disbelief. Each glance reminded her of how quickly judgment could shift, how fragile the surface opinions of others really were. The hum of the engine was like a soft song in her ears, and she allowed herself to breathe deeply. The memory of the dealership still lingered in her mind, the laughter, the dismissive tones, yet those echoes no longer stung. They had been replaced by the sound of respect, by silence, where mockery once had lived. Martha turned down a quieter road lined with tall trees that swayed in the evening breeze. The branches stretched out as if bowing to the road, and the Bentley moved beneath them like a ship guided by stars. Her thoughts returned to her late husband, and she imagined his proud smile beside her. She whispered softly into the air, as though he could hear, "We did it, love. They thought they knew who I was, but they only saw what they wanted to see." A sense of peace washed over her as she continued driving past neighborhoods where children played and families gathered. The car turned heads, but it was Martha who carried the true weight of the story. For behind every polished surface, every luxury seat, was a woman who had been doubted, dismissed, and overlooked, yet she remained unbroken, and now the very world that once laughed was left silent in her presence. Martha slowed the Bentley as she reached the edge of town, the roads opening into wide stretches of countryside. The sky above had turned a deep violet with streaks of gold still clinging to the horizon. The quiet hum of the engine blended with the sounds of crickets and the soft rustle of wind through the fields. She felt the calmness of the open space, a sharp contrast to the crowded streets and judging eyes she had left behind. Here there were no whispers, no dismissive looks, only the steady reminder of freedom. As the Bentley glided forward, she remembered the years when she and her husband had dreamed of such drives. He had often spoken about how one day they would ride together in a car like this, not for show, but for the simple joy of it. The memory warmed her heart, as though he were still seated beside her, sharing the road. Martha turned down a narrow lane, leading toward the small farmhouse she still called home. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, the sound echoing through the still night. She could see the porch light glowing faintly in the distance, a beacon of comfort after a long day. Her neighbors glanced out from their windows as the Bentley pulled in, curious expressions on their faces. Some waved in quiet respect, no words exchanged, just acknowledgement that something in the balance had shifted. Martha parked the car carefully beneath the old oak tree, its branches stretching wide like protective arms. She stepped out slowly, cane in hand, and looked back at the gleaming vehicle, the reflection of the farmhouse lights dancing across its surface. For a long moment, she simply stood there, breathing in the evening air, letting the weight of the day settle into memory. Then, with a small smile, she began her walk toward the porch, her footsteps steady, her spirit unshaken. Martha climbed the porch steps, her cane tapping lightly against the wood. Each creak of the boards felt familiar, a sound she had heard for decades, yet, tonight, it carried a different meaning. She reached the door and turned the handle, stepping inside to the warmth of her small but welcoming home. The scent of old books and lavender filled the air, a comfort she had always cherished. She set her keys gently on the table and glanced once more through the window at the Bentley resting proudly beneath the oak tree. Its polished frame seemed out of place in the humble yard, yet somehow it belonged as much as she did. Martha lowered herself into her favorite chair, the one by the window where she often sat with a cup of tea. She let her eyes drift toward the stars, just beginning to appear one by one across the darkening sky. Her thoughts wandered back to the dealership, to the way she had been dismissed, as if her worth could be measured by worn shoes and a faded coat. She could still hear the laughter, but now it no longer stung. It only reminded her of how far she had come and how easily people could be blinded by their own arrogance. She leaned back in the chair, resting her cane against the arm, her hands folded in her lap, calm and steady. A sense of quiet pride filled her, not for the car itself, but for the strength it represented. Outside, the night grew still, the Bentley gleaming faintly under the moonlight, as if keeping watch over the farmhouse. The world had tried to underestimate Martha, but she had shown in her own way that dignity and resilience could silence even the loudest of doubts. As Martha sat in her chair, the soft ticking of the clock filled the quiet room. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the peace of the evening wrap around her. The Bentley gleamed outside like a sentinel beneath the oak tree, but to Martha it was more than a car. It was a reminder that no one could truly measure her worth by outward appearances. The laughter she had endured was gone, now replaced with respect and silence. The very people who had mocked her now turned their heads in awe. Yet Martha knew her greatest triumph was not in proving them wrong, but in staying true to herself. She poured a cup of tea, her hands steady as she lifted it to her lips. The warmth spread through her body, bringing comfort to her tired bones. A faint smile touched her face as she whispered to the memory of her late husband, "We made it love." The stars shimmered brighter in the night sky as Martha leaned back in her chair, content. Her journey had been long and difficult, but she had arrived with her dignity intact and her spirit unbroken. The world outside would always judge, but within her heart Martha carried the quiet strength of someone who knew her true value, and as the night settled fully around her, she felt no need to prove anything more. Her story had already been written in resilience and in grace.